really excited to bring you two friends of mine, but also Villanova graduates. Shows you that you can get a good job and do something with your life after you graduate. Both Brian and David graduated here in the mid-90s, and they're both doing really exciting things, especially to the topic that we're here for, which is the Arab Spring or Arab Awakening. Both David and Brian have been on the ground in the Middle East, working for various groups such as the NDI, National Democratic Institute, the Solidarity Center, etc. And they're both very well known in their fields. David does special work with strategic communications. But before I begin, I want to thank the Arab Islamic Studies Department and Missions and Ministry and the History Department for co-sponsoring this event. I'll start with David, Brian. You come next.
Sure.
Dave Nassar leads Hotspot Digital, a strategic communication firm that focuses on digital technologies. For the last 15 years, he has worked on projects in the Middle East for the National Democratic Institute, the Solidarity Center, and the International Foundation for Electoral Systems in Yemen, Jordan, Lebanon, Egypt, the West Bank, and Gaza. He has expertise in elections, political parties, and civil societies. At different times, he has helped negotiate settlements between rival political parties in Yemen, designed a new electoral ballot for Jordan, and helped launch the most successful domestic election monitoring organization in the Middle East, the Lebanese Association for Democratic Elections. He has been published in issues related to the Middle East, most recently in the Huffington Post on Tunisia, and after 9/11 was published in the Chicago Tribune, the Philadelphia Inquirer, the Christian Science Monitor, the Miami Herald, and the Baltimore Sun. So I think you're all going to enjoy David say a brief talk. I think they're both going to speak for about 20-25 minutes, and then we'll take questions. And remember, this is an historic time, and let's ask questions pertinent to that. Yesterday, as you all know, Tunisia had its election, the first election that was a result of the Arab Awakening, or the Arab Spring. So let's, in that regard, David, please.
So the first thing is, this is a little weird, and Brian, look over my shoulder. It's up to you, Brian, if you want to, darken your camera or whatever, and so you can do whatever you want. There you go. Cool.
All right, good.
Now you can just listen.
Okay.
Brian and I are good friends, so anyway. First of all, it's a real pleasure to be here. Thank you all for coming. Most of you are probably forced to by being in one class, but in any case, I'm happy to see you and happy to have our honored guests and it's good to see Dr. Gustafson again too after all this time. So the first thing you need to know too is that being here makes me feel really, really old. So if anybody asks me when I graduated and then says things like "wow" or "oh my gosh" or any other exclamation points, that won't go over. But it's good to be back in Villanova. When Marwan asked me to talk about what's happening with regard to the Arab Spring and my own experiences with it, it caused me to come up with a variety of different ideas because my own connection to the Arab Spring is pretty diversified. Brian's going to talk later, and his experience in many ways is much more in-depth and hardcore on what's happening right now. Mine has covered a broad range of topics. I started out my career, I'll give you a little background on me. I started out my career working for a place called the National Democratic Institute for International Affairs for 5 years, working in the Middle East. Is this the mic that's doing that? Okay. Working in the Middle East and working in Yemen, Lebanon, Jordan, a little bit in Egypt, a little bit in West Bank and Gaza. And then from there, I jumped into doing, you can probably mute, you want to mute this? Or he's,
yeah. Yes.
I don't know what he's doing over there.
Sorry.
You're okay, Brian, it's fine. I'm gonna turn down the sound. There we go. Working in the Middle East. And then from there, I came back to the United States and I started working on domestic campaigns. I worked on issue campaigns related to civil rights and political empowerment for minorities in the United States. And then I worked on more traditional campaigns like for a governor's race in New Hampshire or a House race up in the Lehigh Valley. I worked with organized labor on healthcare campaign in New Hampshire, and for about 4 years, I ran a campaign called Walmart Watch, which is a corporate accountability campaign in Washington, funded by the Service Employees International Union, which is a large labor union here in the U.S. All of that work led me to a focus on digital communications around 2006, 2007. It was the growth of social networking, it was the growth of the use of email as a marketing tool, it was the growth of online advertising, the growth of websites as a way of primary communication between people. And as any of you who use the web, and all of you do, I know, realize it's the future. So I decided to take the knowledge that I had in strategic communications and apply it in the digital space. And I started my own company called Hotspot Digital, which I've been doing for the past couple of years, working primarily with nonprofits, or as I like to say, mission-driven organizations, helping them figure out how to use digital tools more effectively to achieve their missions. And then in the last year, what's happened is kind of interesting in my own life, because there's been this intersection of the world that I used to do with the Middle East and this digital communications world, because digital communications have played such an important role in the Arab Spring. So if anybody hasn't, just a little aside, if you haven't gone and watched Steve Jobs' commencement speech at Stanford, which a lot of people may have seen because it was publicized a lot after his death recently, go and watch it. And one of the things Jobs talks about in that speech is that you can never tell where the dots in your life are going to connect. So, in my own life, I never would have predicted that what I do with digital communications and the Middle East would have come together so well. So, I want to talk for a few minutes about an idea of sparks and the fires that they ignite. It's a theme that I've used in a bunch of talks that I've given, because I think it's really the piece that I've been into with regard to the Arab Spring. So let's talk about sparks first of all within my own life. For those of you who are here, all of your students here at Nova now, Nova placed a lot of sparks in me that led me to that background that I was just describing. So with regard to an interest in political theory, with regard to an interest in comparative politics, with regard to an interest in social justice, Arab and Islamic studies, those were all ideas which Villanova planted in me. And that led me to ask kind of big questions when I got out of school that ultimately led me to that work in the Middle East about, what is it that makes certain societies free or certain societies not free? What is it that makes certain systems, government systems, work better than others in terms of how they manage people? And then lastly, coming out of Villanova and sort of an Augustinian worldview, what is it that makes the questions of right and wrong, or the questions of how you manage people in a world that is imperfect, in a way that still strives to try to get to a better world? How do you do that? So that all came from Villanova, and those were sparks that were planted in me, and hopefully they're probably the sparks that are being planted in you too. And that's really important. That took me to Yemen in 1995. So I find myself getting off a plane in 1995, not knowing anybody, in this country that, maybe a month before hopefully I could have found it on a map, but probably didn't know anything about it. And within 48 hours, I was responsible for trying to figure out how to come to an accommodation between the Yemen Socialist Party and the General People's Congress in Yemen. The two, one was the ruling party of the north prior to their unification, the country's unification in 1994. The other was the ruling party of the south. Trying to come to an accommodation among them about how to move forward on a big political party conference that was going to be happening. And the organization that I was working for, their motto was strengthening democratic institutions. And so at the time, I thought that's what I was doing. I thought I was trying to strengthen democratic institutions, in this case, political parties. And so I started, from that point forward, for the next 4 years, working very diligently with political parties, with civil society organizations, with election administrations to try to strengthen them. But along the way, I realized something. I realized that really, with the amount of money that we had, the amount of people that we had, our ability to be able to, this is my own opinion, our ability to be able to really change these deep institutions, whether it be a legislature, a political party, huge election systems, or what have you, to really change them fundamentally was pretty tough and pretty limited. But what we could do, not to say that it's impossible, I think we made some big differences, but what we could do in a very real way was impact people and create sparks in human beings. And take somebody who may have been inclined already to think about how can I make my country more democratic? How can I make, how can I do my part, my small part, to enhance freedom, strengthen liberty, strengthen human rights in my country? How can I do those things? And we supported those people. And we tried to push them forward within the institutions. And I think that, in my own mind, as I move forward with that work, helping them be a stronger voice within their own institutions was really what we were trying to do. So at the time, it seemed a little bit like blowing in the wind, right? I mean, it was 1998, 1999. You couldn't really tell what was going to happen. At the time, I remember being in Cairo and saying to someone, I really believe that there's going to be a day when we're going to see millions of people marching down the streets of Cairo, because there's too much potential in this country. And I thought the same thing about Yemen, and I thought the same thing about Jordan, and I thought the same thing about Palestine. I just didn't know when it was going to happen. And let me just skip forward a little bit. So what did happen? Well, I think it's pretty clear that there were four things going on in the region in the late 90s and the early 2000s, which came to a head in the last year. So one of those was that you had a lot of young people. I mean, I remember being on the streets in all those cities, in Sana'a, in Cairo, in Amman, in Beirut, and you would just see, hundreds of kids under the age of 10 running around playing soccer, particularly in the poor countries, in Yemen and in Egypt, just everywhere, right? So it was clear then that there was going to be this huge population of young people coming up. Another thing you had was a pretty good education system. The money was being pumped into, right? So kids were getting educated. Well, where were these kids going to get jobs? And what was going to happen with that once they came of age? And a third thing that you had is these aging dictators who even back then, even 10 years ago, it was pretty clear, had no intention of giving up power and were going to be trying to do whatever they could to keep a grip on the power that they already had. And I'm thinking specifically of Ali Abdullah Saleh and Mubarak, and not Bashar Assad, but Hafez Assad, his father. And even in the case of Jordan, a country that hasn't seen as much tumult as some of the others, the Hashemite kingdom. So how are they going to hold on to their power? And then the fourth thing that was changing in the region, that was pretty clear, was communication. So one of the ways that these dictators have always held on to power is by keeping a hold of the way that people can communicate with each other and the information that they can get from the outside world. Well, back then it was satellite television, right? Satellite was starting to come into people's homes. People could get CNN, people could get, whatever, it could be, Al Jazeera, which we now have a certain interpretation of in this country. Actually, in 1999, Al Jazeera was like a breath of fresh air in the region. I mean, here you had for years, keep in mind, people had only been able to watch state television with its one mindset viewpoint, and from each country. Al Jazeera came on the scene, and all of a sudden, they were having debates like we would have in the United States on television between policy analysts about what kind of position should be taken in different countries, or about important policy debates. I'm going on an aside, but Al Jazeera became colored because of the Iraq War in this country. And we could have a whole other conversation about that. But you need to understand that in 1999, it really was a breath of fresh air in the region. And then that situation of satellite television would only become more and more opened up with the internet, right? And what the internet brought to the region. So let's take each of those quickly, and I'll focus on the internet more. So young people, we saw that in the region in the Arab Spring, right? That's people, you had just a lot of 20-somethings who were wondering where the jobs were going to come from. That's how Tunisia started. With the immolation of that young man who was just so frustrated that he had gotten an education and all he could do was sell fruits and vegetables. And then the police came and took his fruit and vegetable cart away. And he had absolutely no means to make a living. And not only that, but then they humiliated him to boot and killed him. Egypt. We are all Khalid Said. Right? Khalid Said was killed by police in Alexandria, beaten to death. And another young man who was hoping to have a future and didn't have one. So it's clear that was a factor. The other issue, the dictators, right? The aging dictators. They had only gotten older. They had only gotten more corrupt. They were only trying to hold on to their power even more. And what were they going to do? In the case of Saudi Arabia, Qatar, UAE, those places can dump a lot of money into their populations to try to keep their populations happy. But in places like, and that's one of the reasons why they've been able to hold off revolution in their countries. But in places like Egypt and in Yemen and in Syria, in Libya, there just isn't as much potential to be able to do that. And so, the dictators are forced to just try and control even more. But the problem of trying to control even more in a society today is that we have the internet. What does the internet do? What is the real transformational power of the web? People talk about Twitter, people talk about Facebook, they talk about all these dynamic tools, and it's fun to talk about the tools, and it's sexy to put them up and sort of show what they can do and show the bells and whistles. But the real difference of Twitter and Facebook and all these other tools is that they enable people to create their own credibility. So when I was here at Villanova, if I took part in some sort of activism, which I did, right? Whether or not that march or that rally or that event mattered was often the result of how many people came and whether or not that event got on television or got on the radio, right? And that's true, that's up until the development of the internet, that was true of pretty much all events, right? If a tree falls in the forest and nobody hears it, doesn't matter, right? What the internet did is it changed that. Because now, I could hold an event and 20 people might come, the news might not cover it at all, which in the Arab world is probably a pretty good bet. The news might not cover it at all. I can broadcast it out myself on Twitter. I've got 500 followers, 1,000 followers, 50,000 followers. They all know that it happened. We saw this happen on the streets in Iran very, very clearly, right? Where people weren't sure what was going to happen. Actually, even forget Iran, just go to Egypt. January 25th, people didn't know what was going to happen. They called for that march. They didn't know what was going to happen. But the people started coming down the street, and the tweets started going out, and all of a sudden people knew, even if they couldn't see out their window, there's 1,000 people in the streets. There's 2,000 people in the streets. There's 5,000 people in the streets. And Mubarak had no way to control that. He couldn't clamp down on that. And so that credibility then encouraged people to be able to go out and reinforce it. And then it grew from there, right? Because the more people that you add to that, the more tweets, the more Facebook posts, the more YouTube pictures, all of a sudden it becomes your own broadcasting mechanism. And that's the funny thing about agreement, right? Is that if we could get all the people in Villanova, close off Villanova, get all the people in Villanova to admit and tell each other that the sky is green, even when it's blue, after a certain amount of time, people would believe that the sky was green because everybody's agreeing with each other. And that's what the web has the potential to be able to do among people who are committed to a certain cause. I tell you, you tell you, and it goes forward with this idea that we have to create change, we have to create change, we have to create change. And then we believe we can. And we go out and do it. That's what we're seeing with Occupy Wall Street right now. People said Occupy Wall Street was a joke. They laughed at it. They said it's never going to happen. Just today, driving to the train station to come here, I noticed that a second camp has opened up in Washington. So the one camp was on McPherson Square, which is right up the street from Brian's office. The second camp has opened up down the street now with another, I guess there's another 150, 200 people in the square. So, and it potentially is it may only grow from there. So that's really, I mean, that really has been a transformational power of the web with regard to the Arab Spring. And I think, you know, I got one more point and then I'll stop and I'll let Brian talk. You know, in 2009, I was asked to go to Iraq as part of a State Department delegation of technology people. And on that trip was Jack Dorsey, who's the founder of Twitter. And Jack, I know I had a lot of chances on that trip to talk with him. This was 3 months before Iran. Jack was amazed himself at, and is still amazed, I think, at the power and the way that Twitter has been used. He didn't necessarily anticipate the kind of political engagement that would happen with it. He had a lot of amazing ideas for it, but that wasn't necessarily one of them. And that's the other thing about the web, is that these are just tools. People find all sorts of ways to use them. And it goes back to that idea, to bring it all back now, it goes back to that idea of sparks, right? These tools are sparks. And how people use them is up to those people. Just like the ideas that are put in you at Villanova are sparks. You get to decide how you use it. Or just like the ideas that I may have played a small role in planting an activist in the region and people like me may have done, you know, created sparks which may have had something to do, I'd like to think, had something to do with the Arab Spring. So that's it. I'll stop and let Brian talk and then take questions.
You want to put up the,
Yep.
the volume?
Yep.
Thank you, David. All right, I'm going to introduce Brian Catullis, but before I introduce Brian, I want everyone here, Brian's going to also talk for about 20 minutes or so. But I want everyone here, as remember, you guys are Villanova students. These guys are your alums. Both of them are willing to help you. If you're looking for advice in DC, I'm happy to give both of their emails to you. Take advantage of them. I've had students get jobs because of that. Right, David? Through contacts I've made. So take advantage. And it's not taking advantage, they want to do that. So just remember these people, remember their emails. When I give, if anyone wants them, I will give you their emails. And Brian will get us all jobs at the American Progress, the Center for American Progress, where he works. Brian Catullis, although he has an MBA at Princeton, was one of the first concentrators in Arab Islamic Studies and graduated from Villanova in 1994. I think was that the first year of the concentrators?
No, it was much earlier than that, wasn't it?
Oh, 80, well, all right, David also, I think. But Brian has done a lot of stuff also. He has been a consultant to numerous U.S. government agencies, private corporations, non-government organizations, and has done projects in more than 24 countries, including Iraq, Pakistan, Afghanistan, Yemen, Egypt, and Colombia. And I believe you just came back from Pakistan, correct?
Yes.
He's also been in the Gaza Strip in Egypt. As I said before, he got a master's degree, received a master's degree from Princeton University's Woodrow Wilson School in History and Arab International Affairs. He was a Fulbright scholar in Amman, Jordan, where he conducted research on the peace treaty between Israel and Jordan. And he has published a book called The Prosperity Agenda as a co-author of it, and has had articles published in several newspapers, including Washington Post, Los Angeles Times, Boston Globe, Baltimore Sun, and the Middle East Policy, among other publications. And he works for the Center for American Progress. Brian.
Great. Thank you, Marwan. And thank you all for being very patient with this technology and allowing for me to appear remotely. Do you all hear me loud and clear and see me okay?
Yes.
Okay, good. What I want to do is maybe spend only about 10 or 15 minutes because I really think we can get to the question and answer period and talk largely about the Arab Spring and my observations on it. I can say a little bit about what I do at a think tank here first. But before I do that first, I mean, it's just a great honor to be back at Villanova. I'll be there in about 2 weeks or so to take part in the ceremony. And for any of you who may be interested in what I do or what this center does, I'm more than happy to find time. It's on the weekend of November 11th, 12th, I think I'll be up there. So just email me. And a total open door, because Villanova has helped create the life that I have for myself right now. I would not be doing the sorts of things that I'm doing right now. And I have a strong commitment and now have a little bit more time to try to pay back. And I'd like to do some more of that. And anytime we have people visiting from Villanova down here, or when I get up there, I love to sort of interact. So I'll try to keep it brief. Before I get into the substance of my remarks, though, just three things I wanted to highlight. And I say this when I'm speaking at universities in the United States. I just spoke at about 6 universities in Pakistan between Karachi and Islamabad. But I really fundamentally believe this. 3 sort of basic things. Number 1, think for yourselves. Push yourself to continue to think for yourselves throughout your life. And I'm sure you're doing this in the class with Marwan right now, but always challenge and question those that you're engaged with, but then also question yourself. It's something that I try to do day in and day out at this think tank, which is, again, I can tell you a little bit more about it, but the policy debates that we have in this country, the political debates, I think we need more of a vibrant discussion, and people need to challenge even the positions that they themselves have held. It's something that I try to do each day. Second, follow your passions, and if your passions take you to the Middle East, you will be surprised how far you might go. But you have to think about and be very careful, and David and I talk about this a lot, of what you choose to do, and make sure that you love the thing that you're going into, because it's something that I've had a strong love for ever since I was at Villanova, of what's going on in the Middle East and South Asia, Afghanistan, and Pakistan, and I've nurtured it over the years. But it's sometimes tough. It's sometimes difficult to grapple with, and you think of a different path. But really, I think use this time right now to think through what your passions are. And then the last thing I would say before I get into the substance is nurture your friendships and relationships. David maybe doesn't remember this, but I am in DC in large part because of a call I got when I was in Jordan on a Fulbright scholarship, which many people at Villanova helped me get. And David called me when he was working at this group called the National Democratic Institute. I think he was trying to set some meetings up and things like this. We had never met at Villanova. He's, as you can tell, he's there in person. He's a bit older than I am. And I just had to look at the back of his bald head for the last 15, 20 minutes. But I don't think we ever met actually on the campus of Villanova. We may have sort of coexisted for a year or two. Did you graduate, David?
91, we were here for a year at the same time.
Yeah, that's what it was, okay. But along the way, David and I just sort of met. He was trying to do some work in Jordan. He can correct me if I'm wrong. And we just nurtured that friendship and these relationships that you have. You'll see, going back to my second point, when you start following your passions, the years add up pretty quickly. And you start doing a lot of fun things, raising a family and things like this. But don't forget the friendships and relationships you have. They keep you sort of even keeled, and the people that you can talk to. And it's also, as Marwan was saying, networking advice, but really sort of that life advice. So beyond that, and that was just a couple of minutes, let me just spend about 10, 15 minutes talking about what's going on in the Middle East. I've lived and worked in the Middle East for about 15 or so years. I went to the West Bank and Gaza, lived in the West Bank town of Ramallah and the Gaza Strip for the National Democratic Institute during the period when the Palestinian Authority was first set up. So I'm very comfortable talking about the Arab-Israeli issue, and I hope that comes up because I've got a lot of views on it. But I mostly want to talk about this wave of change and building on what David had talked about in terms of sparks and this new thing that is happening in the Middle East. And my view is that at the start of this year, the Middle East entered a period of transition that will likely take years to unfold. And I liken it to, and I think it's going to take a long time for some of these countries. We may not have full clarity of all of the implications of the changes that are underway until the latter part of this decade. And certainly, those of you who want to go into the field of dealing with the Middle East and understanding it, I think we're in for a period of major transformation. I've argued in some of the work and some of the congressional testimony and consultations I do with this administration that this Arab Spring, and I think this label, obviously, now that we're in the fall, we're going to have to relabel. But I think it's going to go on for quite some time. And I liken it to sort of the fourth major strategic shock the Middle East has experienced since 1979. 1979, obviously, in the Islamic Revolution in Iran, was a major event that I think reordered the region. The 1991 Gulf War, which occurred and actually helped spark my interest in the Middle East. I remember being at Villanova and some of the debates we had about the Iraq War. And then obviously the start of what was labeled the global war on terrorism in 2001. Those were, I think, the three previous sort of shocks that one of which came from within, and then two came from the interventions from the outside. This fourth one, I think, the current uprisings and the political battles that are underway will, I think, take some time. And even though Egypt has moved pretty rapidly, as an example, through the departure of Mubarak in February to a constitutional referendum to elections, the political process, I think, will take a long time. And I think we're at the start of a negotiation over power. The current powers that be, including the generals that run the country, are not likely to yield significant power even as elections move forward. And I think, there are tremendous opportunities in this transformation. And I'll get down into some of the details of the different countries a little bit. But I largely look at things from a policy perspective, a U.S. policy perspective. And I think the biggest opportunity, the greatest opportunity presented by these popular uprisings is to transition these countries from autocratic governments that simply did not provide to their own people. And if you travel to many of the countries in the Middle East, and this is what my book, The Prosperity Agenda, was largely about, is that the basic fundamentals of whether people feel secure, whether they feel secure in their neighborhood, whether they can provide the basic needs to their own family and children, a lot of the systems were broke. And this is what people were protesting against. And I just as a little bit of an aside, I was in Israel the week that Hosni Mubarak stepped down in February. And you probably remember the images of Tahrir Square, the main square in downtown Cairo. And I recall sort of being in a meeting in the Prime Minister of Israel's office, one of his senior advisors. And throughout my whole trip on Israel that week in Israel, before Mubarak stepped down, everybody was saying, why did President Obama throw Mubarak under the bus? And if you go back to that period, you can see that actually President Obama was trying to be studiously neutral and never really saying Mubarak, go. But every single Israeli was saying, why? Why is he throwing this regional ally under the bus after 30 years? And I came out of that meeting, it was a rainy night in Jerusalem, and I got a phone call from a friend of mine, a human rights activist, an Egyptian, who was in Tahrir Square. And he said to me, Brian, why is President Obama standing so strongly behind President Mubarak here in Egypt? So 280-degree opposite perspectives at a time of transition that I think were largely born out of where people were at. But I think this long-term sort of transition that I talk about, there are great opportunities. There are risks. And I think from a U.S. national security perspective, we need to talk about those. Anytime there are changes in the political system and in power structures, I think there's a very real risk of civil wars in countries. And we need to remember, as Middle East analysts, that 3 countries in the last 3 decades have been devastated by civil wars. Iraq in the previous decade, and all of these countries had more than 100,000 people killed. Lebanon in the 1980s, and then also Algeria in the 1990s. And I think that's one of the risks. There's a real risk of prolonged insurgencies in places like Yemen and in Syria, as we see today. And then there's also the risk that I think is not as high as the other ones, but of new regional wars across borders. And we see this in the most recent events, again, with Turkey pursuing some of the Kurdish rebels into Iraqi territory, as they did back in 2005, 2006, 2007. And some of these things could potentially spill out of control. But I think on balance, in my view, is given all of the opportunities that are there for a decent government in these societies, and the popular desire for change, as David talked about in his talk, I think it really presents a lot of challenges for U.S. policymakers. I think what is it? We're close to 10 months into the popular uprisings, and again, we all need to work together. Maybe we can do this in our conversation about what do we call this thing called the Arab Spring, because it will take several years and it will last many seasons. But I think you could look at three main categories of countries that have experienced some impact from the Arab Spring. Number one is, and Marwan mentioned this, the Tunisias and the Egypts of the world. So far, these countries have had relatively peaceful, relatively orderly transitions. And I think these are fundamentally incomplete. I'm deeply worried about some of the recent trends in Egypt, which we can talk about in the back and forth. But on balance, I think this is one category of countries where I would say so far so good in that first category, both for the people of these countries and for U.S. national security interests. I think the second category are the countries that have responded to popular unrest with moves to negotiate a settlement with their people and renegotiate from the top down largely some forms of their political system. And in these countries, I would include Morocco, Jordan, Algeria, perhaps Saudi Arabia. You see some of the steps that were made to allow women to vote in 2015. But there's this process of, and we'll see how real some of those dynamics are. But as opposed to the first sort of category where there's a real sort of prospect for serious leadership change in both Egypt and Tunisia, I think the second category, it's unclear. And during the previous decade, particularly after the Iraq War, you had a phenomenon after George Bush had launched his what he called the Freedom Agenda. You had a number of countries in the Gulf region and other places, and we can talk about Lebanon, but you had a number of Gulf countries do window dressing sort of political reforms, what some have called liberalizing autocracies, just opening up the press freedom just enough, but not fundamentally changing the way power is actually ordered and how people have a voice in that. But in that second category, I think it's really unclear. I think on balance, longer term, it will be very difficult for many of these countries to withstand the tide of popular discontent and simply just do modest reforms, especially poorer countries like Jordan or Morocco, those that lack the fundamental financial resources. I think the third category of countries are the ones that we should all worry about, and they're the most difficult. I think Libya still is in this category, despite the death of Muammar Gaddafi last week, though I think it's looking a lot more positive to a number of individuals right now. And it's those countries that have experienced a significant degree of violence, either between different factions or largely, I think, as a result of brutal crackdowns, arrests, shootings. I think the most extreme case we have right now is Syria. And again, I'm happy to talk about all of these things in the U.S. policy response to it. But I think Syria is one of the most difficult cases to deal with from a U.S. policy perspective, because our leverage is not very good after decades of sanctioning ourselves out of leverage. And our ability to shape internal dynamics is not as strong as it is in countries like Turkey and other countries that have stronger economic and diplomatic ties. In this category, I would think Yemen is right there. And I know people in the White House who worry day in and day out about Yemen, not only because of what's going on inside and the prospect of another civil war. Yemen itself had its own civil war in recent decades, but also because of the number one threat, at least until the killing of Anwar al-Awlaki, the leader of al-Qaeda in the Arabian Peninsula, was deemed to be AQAP and not the sort of al-Qaeda remnants that we hear about in Pakistan, the last country I went to. And I also think, Bahrain, even though it's quieter right now, the brutal crackdown that we saw through the spring and the summer leads one to question whether they will be able to craft some sort of sustainable political framework moving forward. And lastly, Libya. Again, major milestone that Muammar Gaddafi's gone. The way that the U.S. went about doing this, I've been debating on some TV, radio programs, have been largely supportive of how the Obama administration has used national power, or U.S. national power. But the story is long from being over. And I actually think, based on my own experiences on the ground in Iraq Afghanistan, and places like this, that the most difficult work comes after leadership transitions and comes to how do you actually help these societies create the political frameworks to move forward. I'm going on a little bit here, and I'll try to draw it to a close, but those are three main categories of countries. I hope it's a useful analytical framework, but don't consider it sort of set in stone in any sort of way. Nor should I think U.S. policy. I've been sort of at one point saying very critical of the lack of a U.S. strategy, but I think when things are so dynamic, when things are so driven by events on the ground and by political actors on the ground, and you add to it this trend in sort of U.S. politics these last couple of months, and certainly over the last couple of years, where national security and foreign policy has really declined because of the problems in terms of how much we debate these sorts of things. I think on balance, the U.S. plays an important leadership role and will continue to, but I think the real trick for U.S. policymakers will be to figure out what sort of leverage do we have in a case like Egypt, and how useful is it for us to publicly give democracy assistance program money, the sorts of money that David and I think worked on throughout the police, publicly give this, and how much blowback is there potentially from doing that sort of work. And I think we need to be flexible and open-minded, because there's, in a place like Egypt, certainly a lot of pushback and pride and nationalism about the notion that people coming in from America and other places telling them how to do things. And I think maybe we can get into the question and answer about this. I'm not saying let's disengage. I'm just saying we need to be mindful of how the United States is viewed throughout much of the part of the place. I'm not going to talk much about Pakistan and Afghanistan, though I'm happy to take your questions. But Pakistan, I think, is the prime case where there have been elections, and I think there's been an opening in Pakistan. But I think the political opening, I think, is still overridden by the fact that you have a security state where we're trying to cooperate with their military and their intelligence agencies, who really control sort of the situation in Pakistan. And my biggest fear for a country like Egypt is that even if they have relatively peaceful and free and open elections, that the powers that be will remain in power behind the scenes, like we see in a place like Pakistan, and that we won't have a true opening that helps the country of Egypt not only have a government where people can speak more and have a say in what their government does, but a society that's much more open. I'll close sort of with where I think U.S. policy should go on all of this. I think, number one, on balance, the Obama administration, and we can debate this, I think given all of its priorities, I think has struck the right sort of tone on most of the challenges related to the Arab Spring. It has carefully calibrated and tailored its policies according to what it assessed to be its leverage to shape outcomes. And that's why I think, for those in Israel, and then also, by the way, in Saudi Arabia, who agreed with many Israelis that said that we were throwing Mubarak under the bus, they need to respond to the millions of Egyptians who were dissatisfied with the way things were run under Mubarak. And I think that there's some sort of change that's inevitable. So I think on balance, the different multifaceted approach, the fact that we didn't as vocally back the democracy protesters in Ukraine, I think it comes back to sort of how the U.S. assesses its own interests. And I've been critical of that, but I also understand that what happens in Bahrain, a country where we have a fifth fleet of the U.S. Navy and seen as a key pillar of containment against Iran, we wouldn't necessarily approach what's going on in Bahrain the same way that we would in places like Egypt and Tunisia. The two other sort of policy issues that I think shouldn't fall from the scene when we talk about the Middle East and Middle East of dynamic change and transformation would be, of course, Iraq with President Obama's announcement this past week of the U.S. drawdown in Iraq. I think that signals, a new phase in our relationship with Iraq, where the State Department, or many people in the U.S. government, or on the civilian agencies, will be asked to do more. And I suspect also, by the way, that no matter whatever, and I just debated Bob Woodward, Ted Koppel, and Jack Keane on a national radio program this afternoon about this announcement. I think President Obama has done the right sort of thing given the constraints that we have. But we'll still stay engaged in Iraq. I think the story, like in Libya and other places, is far from over in Iraq. And the struggle for building a new Iraqi government and a new politics will go on for years, if not decades. And I think there's an opening. I was against the war in 2003, but once we were in there, I think we need to stay in and stay engaged with the right sort of civilian support with the Iraqi government. And then finally, last but not least, Arab-Israeli. I hope this opens things up. I think that it would be a travesty, and it has been a travesty, the way the Trump administration has handled and mishandled the relationship with our ally Israel and then our partners in Palestine. Coming into office, President Obama declared a two-state solution as in the U.S. national security interest. And I hope we talk a little bit about this, but I do fundamentally believe that no new Middle East, even this Middle East that's going through transformation, will ever be fundamentally stable without addressing this core conflict, the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, from the perspective of a just and sustainable South. And I hope we can get into this a little bit, but I think the Obama administration said a lot of good things in speeches in Cairo, in speeches at the UN General Assembly. He appointed a lot of good people, including former Senator George Mitchell, but they didn't succeed. And they've failed. I have low expectations of any sort of serious Palestinian state emerging, whether or not their attempts at the UN General Assembly succeed in doing anything. But this goes back to a central point, that unless this core conflict is resolved justly and in a manner that leads to and produces sustainable results, I think we're going to still see a Middle East that's in turmoil, a Middle East at popular levels has a lot of dissatisfaction with the way things are. And I think this is one piece of the equation that many of you, if you go out to work in the Middle East, we should not give up on, because I don't see any alternative at this point to a two-state solution. A lot of people have talked about the one-state solution, and I just don't see it's viable either from the Israeli or from the Palestinian interests. But I will say that at this dark hour, we have simply not succeeded. And at a time when there's so much hope and change and the prospect for hope and change in the Middle East, I'm glad that the Palestinians are trying to use peaceful means to try to keep this on the international and U.S. national security agenda. I'll close there. I've gone on far longer than I hoped, but I gave you a little bit of a framework of how I'm looking at things. I'm happy to talk a little bit more about what the center does, what I've done throughout my career. But just remember those three things I said at the outset. This is one class where you can develop your knowledge and develop your capacity to think for yourself, but continue to do that through life. Follow your passion, and then nurture those friendships and relationships. Remember those sorts of things. I know that sounds general, but it's so important, I think, as you go through the years, to keep those three things in mind. And I look forward to what I'm sure will be an interesting discussion on the Middle East.
Thank you, Brian. A lot of time to ask both of our guests questions. So I've been telling our deans and provosts and everybody here what an intelligent class I have. So let's hear some good questions. That's what I like to hear. Now, can you hear? Brian, can you hear? Go ahead, try to ask.
Yes.
This can go to either person, but I know that democracy in terms of individual rights and freedoms is what they're pushing for, but democracy is also an expensive system to institute and maintain. For some of these poor Middle Eastern countries, is democracy even feasible for them because of its high cost?
Did you hear that, Brian?
Yeah. David, do you want to take that first, and then I can follow up?
Sure. In terms of, brass tacks, is democracy expensive? Sure, it can be. But I mean, I think if you're looking at just pure dollars and cents, the way they've been running their countries now isn't cheap either. I think in the long run, getting more people engaged in your political process ultimately could potentially save money too. But I don't think fundamentally that's the key factor that people are looking at in terms of how to move forward or not move forward. The bigger issue is if they can manage a democratic system. From the challenges related to how do you engage people in the political process, how do you create the transparency that's necessary and the accountability that's necessary, and all of those steps. Go ahead, Brian.
Yeah, sorry. There we go.
You can leave the camera.
I would agree with what David had said right there. I mean, you could look at the way that many of these autocratic governments have run their systems as being terribly inefficient in terms of cost. I don't know if you saw the most recent figure of how much Muammar Gaddafi had rifled away in banks around the world. My friend Paul Richter, who writes for the Los Angeles Times, said that the recent estimates placed it at $200 billion, which is, I think, about 30,000 per Libya. And now Libya is a different case. It's a real sort of rich, oil-rich country. I think places like Yemen, I don't know if the economic wealth, because you can find examples of very poor countries that have open and somewhat decent political systems when it comes to democracy. I think one of the biggest challenges is less about economics, though Yemen and other places that are resource poor will have those challenges. I think there's going to be a real challenge that I saw on the ground in places like Iraq, which it's still an unresolved debate among Iraqis of how do you actually set up a system of governance that not only is effective, that delivers, but then also reflects the values of that society. And one of the more controversial things that I've said here in DC policy debates, including in congressional testimonies, shouldn't be controversial at all, but it's this. It's that Americans have to get adjusted to the fact that political Islam in various forms will naturally play a much greater role and have a much greater voice in a number of political systems throughout the Middle East. And I actually think that that's not an easy debate for many Muslims to have. It's certainly not a debate for people on Capitol Hill that they're willing here, I think, to listen to. The fact that forces like the Muslim Brotherhood are quite likely to have a significant voice in future Egyptian governments. And my main point here is that, that in some sort of way, the political debate, the ideological debate, the deep, very deep debates that are happening within Islam right now over ijtihad and how to reinterpret the eternal principles of the religion, on balance, I don't see there's anything fundamentally incompatible with Islam and democracy. We see countries like Turkey and others going through this evolution. Though, it will be, I think, a difficult debate for these societies to have. Pakistan has certainly had it and gone through certain phases. My worry is that given some of what we've seen in the last year or so, you've seen in this country with the Sharia Islamophobia and, the referendums in certain states like Oklahoma banning Sharia and Islamic law, I wonder if our policymakers are mature enough, and people in Capitol Hill in particular, to recognize this as what is a fundamental trend and one that I think we're going to have a lot of uncertainty, but I think on balance will lead to very positive things.
Great question, though. Great question.
Kind of going off what she asked, but you said there was $200 billion that Gaddafi had, kind of hidden away. Could they somehow get to that, or like through all the banks they have, and give that back to the Libyans? I mean, that's a ton of money that, she was saying, it's a lot of money. Like, it costs lots more democracy. That'd be a huge, step in the right direction.
Brian, you're probably more on top of that than I am.
Yeah, they are actually, when the NATO campaign began, and it began after the UN Security Council Resolution 1973 earlier this spring. I was there, I was at the White House in the Roosevelt Room, which is this conference room right across the hallway from the Oval Office. And there were about 10 people in there from the outside, and then a number of people from the various US government agencies. And as you know, the US government has many different agencies that run and have an impact on foreign policy, in addition to the Pentagon, the State Department, and others. And what impressed me the most in this session, which was mostly a briefing, but then an interactive session where we were giving some advice, was that what the Treasury Department was doing at that very early period. trying to, and I think this has been one of the things in the last 10 or 15 years that has changed substantially in terms of U.S. capacity, to actually try to tease out and figure out where, at that moment, it was how can we actually squeeze Gaddafi and his regime in the international banking system and then uncover a lot of his assets. I'm not an expert in this, but it struck me hearing the briefing that was coming from the U.S. Treasury Department, how much quicker and more nimble we've been at sort of figuring out targeted sanctions and other things. And at that early moment, I think they had uncovered estimates that were much, much, much lower. And in fact, it's very hard. This $200 billion figure, even though I just said it, I would question. I don't think anybody fundamentally knows, because the way these dictators work, and we saw this in Serbia with Milosevic and other places, is they set up shell companies, they set up front companies, they have cousins and others. So it's very, very hard to pinpoint it. But I think they'll very aggressively try to do this. I had the Libyan ambassador to the U.S. here at one of his first talks in Washington in April at the Center for American Progress. And this was one of his key concerns, because he wasn't actually getting paid. He had actually been the previous ambassador under the Gaddafi government, resigned, and he was the ambassador for at the time, the National Transition Council. So yes, I think they're doing a much better job. Will they uncover all of the money? I doubt it. I think they're still trying to find tens of millions of dollars that Saddam Hussein and other dictators had ferreted out of the country. I think ultimately, David said this in response to the previous question, I think like the pathway to these sort of societies is not uncovering the money that their dictators squandered. I think one of the biggest challenges for the Middle East is figuring out how to actually connect this broader region to the global economic grid, and do it in a way that is not just simply oil wealth, because it's certainly connected through oil resources and other things. But there's a great potential, I think, for growth, especially with the younger generations in the Middle East. Some frame that as sort of an opportunity and a negative thing. I actually think with educated populations, especially those countries that have invested in education, there's tremendous potential in the Middle East in the medium to longer term.
I'm happy to talk about that more. I've thought quite a bit about it, but just an interesting anecdote about the money in Libya. I mean, Brian, correct me if I'm wrong, but I think one of the sort of somewhat underreported stories was that during the Libyan war was that one of the ways that the Libyan rebels paid for the war in the early days is that they became bank robbers. And in Benghazi and in some other places, they went in and they blew up banks and went in and took money. And if I recall the story correctly, the initial order for doing that was given by a Libyan who is a former professor from the University of Washington, who returned from the University of Washington at the request of the rebels to Libya to become essentially the Secretary of the Treasury. And he gave the order to blow up the bank and steal the money.
Yeah, I heard that too. This is the last thing. I will take on the next question.
Yeah.
I mean, what's interesting is that when I was in Doha, Qatar, in the spring, speaking at a conference, in my hotel, the Libyan rebels, their leadership was actually at the top level. And as we know, Qatar is a monarchy, certainly not an open political system, but Qatar was at the forefront of spurring sort of this facade, at least, of Arab unity that led to UN Security Council Resolution 1973. And then they participated in a quiet way militarily, and then actually funded a lot of these guys too. So there's strange bedfellows. This is the interesting thing, where nobody's really taken a step back at the sort of confused period in which we've arrived at in the Middle East, and I think will be for a long time, where you have monarchs, and I think Gaddafi was a different case for a variety of reasons, but monarchs like Qatar supporting the overthrow of the powers that be in a certain government like Libya, or you see the strange alignments on Syria right now, and quite certainly the Maliki government in Iraq, this government that has benefited from hundreds of millions of dollars of U.S. taxpayer support. Now, very pretty solidly aligning itself with Bashar al-Assad, shows my age, and the Assad regime. So this is, I think we're going to have more of this, where different, partners don't always agree with the best way to approach potential for leadership change.
Question?
Regarding concessions towards women in the Middle East, is this something that's going to have to be progressive? And, well, first off, does anyone really want this in the Middle East, or is this something that they feel it needs to happen, in order to prevent further revolution in some of the richer countries like Saudi Arabia or United Arab Emirates, or, it would be tough for them to, I would imagine, for them to just say, hey, here's all this stuff. I don't think women would be able to accept it, because of the culture. Yeah, what's their stance on this, I guess? What's their
You want
policy?
to go first, Brian, or you want to go first?
Yeah, let me start with just really quickly. I mean, I think, and I've written a little bit about this, and I can send you guys. This is sort of deep, dark in my past from like 2002 to 2004. Can you hear me still?
Yeah.
Okay, yeah, sorry. The women's rights issue in places like Iraq, and I add Afghanistan, although I know it's not the Middle East, but it's a place I work. But women's rights in places like Morocco and Egypt, I did some studies on the ground in these countries, which I can send to you. And these issues are very divisive, and it cuts to the core nature of power in these societies. And I think it's really, I mean, first of all, one thing that I think happened in the first couple of years after Iraq, and I'm talking 2004, 2005, when I was doing a lot of this research, the brand of Hurriya, freedom, or democracy, really had been sullied by the chaos that had erupted in a place like Iraq. And I remember being in Iraq, doing a lot of research on the ground of ordinary Iraqis, and this was about 3-4 months into after the invasion. And you had a lot of concern about Hurriya, freedom, being not only chaos, which was what they were seeing on the streets, but licentiousness and a sense of degradation of moral values and other things. And at that time, people forget this, but much of Iraq under Saddam Hussein, most of it, did not have satellite television. And I remember going in 2003, and when people were finally buying satellite TV and not only getting Al-Hura, but getting some of the Lebanese channels that had Oprah Winfrey and other things. This was I think giving people a lot of pause. And so I think there was this instant reaction which spilled over into the women's rights issues, which at that time, there was in some of these countries, some serious steps forward, like Morocco had revised what they called the Mudawana, which was a set of laws related to women's rights. And there was a very vociferous debate about whether that sort of reform was in line with or contrary to the principles of Islam. Flash forward to 2011, and about 9-10 months into the Arab Spring, and this is just an anecdote, and please remember that the plural of anecdote is not data. So I've not been to Kuwait recently, but I was talking to a couple of analysts on Kuwait, and they were people who were working on women's rights, and with some of the women who actually pushed for the right for women to vote. And I think there's been a bit of a backlash when in some of these richer countries like Kuwait, and certainly in Saudi Arabia, mixed bag because the women are still pushing for their rights there. But what was interesting in Kuwait was this observation of, well, what's unfolding in some of these countries. We've gotten, the right to vote. We've gotten the right to participate here in this country. Don't push us too far. Our system, we need to develop it ourselves. And this was being told to American analysts and some of the political development experts. So I think, again, if you could keep one notion with you from the substance of my remarks, it's this notion of power transforming itself, but not through elections or through singular moments when a former dictator is killed and shot in the head, but a negotiation over power in these societies that will take a long time and will touch upon the factors of not only gender, as your question indicates, but the role of religion and other things. And that's what I think will be so exciting, because finally, after decades of a lot of this being sort of kept underneath the surface in these societies, it's being unleashed by the power and part of what David was talking about, the tools of social networking and other things.
So I would just add to that, I think I agree with everything Brian said. It's an issue that I've thought a lot about over the years. In 1997, I was organizing domestic election monitors in Yemen, which without going into all of it, it's simply organizing people within their own country to monitor their own elections, as opposed to, not as opposed to, but in addition to international election monitors. And in Yemen, men and women vote separately. They vote in the same polling station, but it's usually divided somehow with a wall or a curtain or something. And so you need female election monitors and you need male election monitors to be able to monitor the vote, right? So I organized female trainers to go out and train female election monitors all across the country so that they could monitor the vote, so that the vote would be counted accurately. They're very proud of the fact that they were never actually taken over until the Turks brought in some air power in the 30s. So you have these striking images of women going up the hillsides to get to these villages, to be able to convince the sheikhs in these communities to let them train the women in those communities to monitor the vote so that women could vote in the process. That image being what it is, what Brian said is absolutely right. The thing that transforms culture is not a singular event. Those singular events may add up to something, but they in and of itself don't. I think that there are many men and women and men, I should say, in countries all across that region who understand very clearly that as long as 51% of their population is not fully empowered and engaged in the process of governing, that they can't fully advance as societies. Many of those same people would also point to us and say, you know, United States of America, only 17% of your legislature is female. And there are, I think, Brian may know, something like 16 countries in the developed world, I forget the number, that have a higher percentage of women in their elected legislatures than we do. Last election was actually the first time since 1970-something that the number of women in the legislature, in their Congress, did not go up. So there's that kind of a striking difference where they understand that they need to move forward. But they also look around the world and they say, don't push, as Brian said, don't push us too hard, don't push us too fast. We're trying and we have to figure this out and figure out where we're going to go. And then the last thing I would just say about it is that, to my earlier points in my talk, change, I think, is about information, access to that information, and the ability to be able to organize amongst yourselves to be able to do something about the information that you have. We've seen that information is become more available. Access to that information has become more available. And now with the development of democratic systems at a slow pace, the ability to be able to organize, to do something about the information that you have is becoming more possible. So I think you put all those things together and change, if not inevitable, becomes more likely. But that doesn't mean it's going to happen tomorrow. And given our own experience, we should be a little patient.
Brian talked a little bit about the Arab-Israeli conflict and how a resolution to that is really kind of critical to the functionality of this area as a whole. Where do you think that solution is going to come from? Is it going to come from a private compromise between Israelis and Palestinians, from someone mediating it, or from a third party just kind of imposing this solution on them? Or where does that solution have to come from for it to be successful?
Can you hear that, Brian?
Yeah, it's got to come from within. And it's not in my biography, but I spent a little bit of time in the second Clinton administration in very junior positions, and at a time when they were at the end of the Oslo process. And first and foremost, it's got to come from both Israelis and Palestinians. And this is why I'm skeptical at this point that we have a partner either in the form of the Israeli leadership and then the Palestinian leadership, and I can go on forever. I think there are a number of things that need to happen, but ultimately any sort of peace agreement needs to come from within, which is why I think, though I don't think it's going to take them very far, I think it's encouraging that the Palestinian Authority is using diplomatic and political means to try to stress and push its agenda of building a state. And I understand sort of its positions on not wanting to negotiate directly with the Israelis while the Israeli government expands settlements in the West Bank. I mean, I used to, as I mentioned, used to live in Ramallah. I go back maybe every 6 months or so to Palestine and Israel, and I don't even recognize neighborhoods that I lived in 15 years ago or so. So I think what's got to happen, which nobody's really been able to figure this out, but fundamentally, because Israel is the powerful party in this negotiation, there's got to be some sort of change that comes from within. And you know, we didn't mention this, but all of these protests that we see in Philadelphia, or I see right down the block here, Israel had its own form of protest, not related to the peace process, but to its own sort of economic woes and discontent. And I think the political spectrum in Israel, since I live there, like on the ground in the mid-1990s, really has moved far to the right. And the incentives for the current leadership, political leadership in Israel, is not to try to be bold and negotiate something. But I think if you look sort of medium to long term, and I talk like maybe 2 or 3 years from now, the current trends won't sustain itself inside of Israel. I think there's a pragmatic recognition that as the region's changing, Israel's going to have to adopt an approach. I don't think it's coming from this political leadership and the current Israeli government. I think it's coming from the smart strategic analysts and political actors who are disorganized right now. But I think they themselves pragmatically recognize that Israel itself, even before the Arab Spring began, the thing that I remember was on the forefront of the minds of Israelis was the fact that there was change in the Lebanese government with the Hezbollah party taking over in January. So everybody forgets about that in the wave of Tunisia and Egypt and what's going on right now. So this sense of isolation, which I think has only grown with the tensions between Israel and Turkey, a key NATO ally of the United States, I as an analyst, I don't think there's any sort of eureka moment, especially between now and 2012, where the U.S. will force anything, or can even. But I think that the change will have to come first from within in Israel, and then second, obviously, you know, they need a partner that's unified. And there have been attempts, especially earlier this spring, between Hamas and Fatah to bridge their divides. Still has not come to fruition. But does that mean there's no role for the outsiders? No. I mean, absolutely. I think there is a role for countries like the U.S. and others. But at this stage, until the parties themselves demonstrate a seriousness to sort of present clear plans, there's nothing for us to fundamentally invest in. I think, and we can talk about this, but I think the Obama administration has decided it's going to tread water on this, hope that there's still a window of opportunity for a two-state solution if it gets reelected in 2013. And then maybe we'll look at ways to try to help reconfigure the political scenario inside of the both Israel and Palestinian politics. I mean, people forget, and this is the last thing I'll say, is that the notion that the U.S. does not intervene in Israeli politics is completely false. 3 presidents recently, I think, had a deep impact on Israeli politics. George H.W. Bush, and what it did to try to exercise leverage on the Israeli government in 1991. Bill Clinton, I think, played a very active role in staking out policy positions that then became part of the political debate inside of Israel and helped lead to government changes there. And then similarly, I think George W. Bush, with his, I just spent actually, part of the reason I'm not there is I had to spend some time with Bush's ex-National Security Advisor, Steve Hadley. We were talking about this a little bit, but they fully embraced Israel in a way that created less incentives for them to move forward with a peace agreement. So, I mean, long-winded, sort of, it's got to come from within. We can't sort of artificially construct it. But we can actually offer different types of support, and I think we need to sort of fundamentally rethink the way we've been doing business since the Egypt-Israel Camp David Accords of 1979. The conditions are forcing us to do that, and at some point we're going to need to rethink all sorts of relationships in the region.
So I think I would just add to that and say that I think that to some extent Palestinians have been answering that question themselves for 15 years now, actually going on long before that, but in a nonviolent way for about 10 to 15 years now. And in the last few years have been answering it in a big way. It doesn't get a lot of press, but Palestinians have been mobilizing nonviolently since long before the Arab Spring started. And a lot of it is small, but it's been getting bigger and bigger. And they've been bringing in more Israelis come in, more internationals come in, and the actions have become more effective. And to a certain extent, they're raising that voice and trying to take control themselves. Two things, the Free Gaza movement, which many of you probably read about, the boats that sailed from Turkey last year where 9 people were killed, was organized by a mix of international, mostly leftists, but international leftists and Palestinians. And it was a movement which largely said, people said was crazy, right? You're going to sail a boat from Cyprus to Gaza through the Israeli Navy, and you're going to bring supplies in, and how is that going to change anything? Well, they did it, and sadly 9 people were killed. It changed the debate. I don't know whether Brian would agree with me or not, but from my perspective, they put the subject of Gaza back on the international table, to the point where when they launched Free Gaza 2, which was supposed to send a fleet of now something like, I think it was 30 ships out of Turkey. And by the way, they raised enough money internationally that they actually bought ships. So think about that for a second, right? They bought ships and they stocked them. It raised the level of attention to the point where President Obama, Secretary Clinton, Secretary General of the UN, and a host of other international figures were commenting on the fact that these ships were going to sail. And these were people, again, who were largely, had been discredited. They had said they were a bunch of leftists, they were a bunch of nuts. They changed the debate. So their argument, and I don't agree with everything they say by a long stretch, but a piece of it that I definitely do agree with is those activists say, the world has largely missed the point about what's happening in Palestine and Israel. And they're not solving the problem. And Brian, I think, said that very clearly. They're not solving the problem. We failed. And so if they're not going to solve the problem, then somebody needs to step up and try to solve the problem. And so I think, to a certain extent, if the official institutions don't, it is going to be people. Because Palestinians are just tired. And I think there's a lot of Israelis, a good chunk of the population that's just tired and doesn't understand why this thing can't get solved. We've known what the solution is for years. And they just can't seem to nail it down.
I'm going to ask a quick question for both David and Brian. I'm selfish on this because I'm half Lebanese, as is Father Ellis. And Father Ellis was in Lebanon. He's full Lebanese. He's full Lebanese. I'm half Lebanese. Lebanon. Lebanon looks like an oasis of stability right now. Temporarily in the Arab world. Where is Lebanon going? What do you see as the future of Lebanon? Maliki government, Hezbollah.
Brian, I'll say something quickly and then I'll let you talk. I was in Lebanon longer before, much further back than Father Ellis, in May of last year for a few days. And the thing that I was struck by, I wrote a piece in Huffington Post about it, which you can go and read. The thing that I was struck by was that, I've been in a bunch of countries around the world. There's a global recession. But you go to Beirut, and there's cranes everywhere, right? They're just building like crazy. And from my days doing Middle East stuff, I know some people in the parliament, I know some people at high levels in the government, and I had lunch with them. And I asked this one member of the parliament, how is it that everywhere else I go in the world, there's a global recession, and in Lebanon, you guys are like the country's on fire? And he said, well, number one, money has to go somewhere, right? Number two, we have a really secure banking system. And they do. They have a really secure banking system. Number three, something I didn't know, in all the years of the Lebanese Civil War, Lebanon never defaulted on its debt. And so people, particularly the Saudis and others from the Gulf, see it as a safe place to put money. And so Lebanon has actually fared the global recession pretty well. And if there's one thing that drives my ancestral homeland as well, is let's make a buck. You can make a buck. It's a good thing, and that does take some priority. But that said, I think that they clearly face real challenges politically, and Lebanon will never. I don't think there'll ever be a day when Lebanon won't, to some extent, be the region's soccer ball. And I'll stop there and I'll drop that.
Yeah, I really would like to defer to Father Ellis. I would love to hear what he has to say. Not that I've not followed it, but I think, David, what you just said about the economic fundamentals being strong. I mentioned I was in Pakistan a couple of weeks ago, or I just came back last week. And in some ways, when you were talking, David, about the economic fundamentals there in Lebanon, I thought of the city of Karachi in southern Pakistan. And as you know, Pakistan has got 180, 190 million people. It's got nuclear weapons. It's got problems with terror. And the city of Karachi is just a fascinating, amazing city, which has so many ethnic and political rivalries, armed gangs, people at each other's throats. And yet it's still, and also you add to it sort of displaced persons coming from conflicts in the tribal areas of Pakistan, and in fact, some linkage to the war in Afghanistan with Afghan members of the Afghan Taliban now setting up shop in parts of Karachi. So you have all of these regional dynamics, you have all of these internal tensions just in the city of Karachi, and it moves forward. It's got this economic engine, and at any moment, those sort of tense rivalries, I think, can explode. And that's a very simplistic parallel, I think, to where Lebanon is today. And may show sort of betray my ignorance, but but the system, as David said, I think to some extent has incentives where it creates some economic growth despite all of the political blockages between the factions. And I think the real shame is that for time and time again, you have so many talented people in Lebanon and leaders in Lebanon who move forward or try to move the country forward, and quite often, every now and again, the country descends back into either some internal chaos or some stress from an invasion from the south or pressures from the region. So I'd love to hear if Father Ellis would give us a little bit of wisdom on Lebanon, because while on one hand remain hopeful that in a period of such political uncertainty and chaos in the region, people continue to invest and move forward, I always worry about the next sort of spark that could light a fire that destroys a lot of the things that people are trying to construct now.
If you want to say.
All right, well, I mean, I think as David said, Lebanon will always be the soccer ball for the region. But I think what's interesting about Lebanon, what's going on in Syria today, and it's already spilled over in the border in terms of refugees coming from, I mean, it's really ironic in a sense, because before, during the civil wars, there's refugees who go from Lebanon to Syria. But also when you have the stability of the regime, how stable that is, and, we don't know yet, because the United States, I mean, I see Senator McCain said, military action should be taken in Syria. I don't think that's going to happen. But I do think that the role of Hezbollah and its dependence upon Syria as a conduit and support for its activities within Lebanon is going to be very interesting to watch as it plays out, and particularly with Syria and Iran. But the one area, the one country that hasn't figured into the equation right now is Turkey. And Turkey is really asserting a whole regional role. You're talking about the flotilla, the Gaza flotilla, and coming from Turkey. But Turkey said it would escort the flotilla with its warships. Meanwhile, you have Israel allied with Greece, taking oil explorations off the coast of Cyprus, and Turkey being very upset with that. So the whole region is really somewhat up in flux. But I think what's very fascinating is the role of Turkey and its assertion of
The new Ottomanism?
the new Ottomanism.
Yeah.
Whatever they call
And
it.
I think that Turkey is now supporting reform efforts in Syria. I think that if there's some indication that they are, if not actively, then indirectly involved in helping to strengthen the opposition in Syria.
Dr. Malik, do you want to say anything on Pakistan? Or? Okay. Any other questions? We got a couple times. I'm going to ask more questions. Walter? No? What I thought was very interesting that you mentioned, Brian, and I'm getting back to your Center of American Progress, is what the impact on this Islamophobia, fear of Sharia in the United States will have over in the Arab and Muslim world. If you can talk about that more, because, I mean, when we talk in the United States, when our policymakers talk about the Middle East, we're worried about Islamism over there and anti-Americanism. How do they view all this made-up controversy? And I'm looking at a lot of what Matt, your colleague Matt Deuce, did on the Fear Incorporated report. Maybe you can bring that up. How much is our anti-Islam, anti-Sharia phobia taken up and discussed overseas?
I don't think they care, quite frankly. And this is just based on this year alone, I've been to Turkey a number of times, Qatar, I mentioned, Palestine, Israel, Pakistan, Afghanistan, I forget where else. And I remember I was in Lahore in February when a lot of stuff was going on with a CIA contractor named Raymond Davis, and there was a lot of heated tensions between the US and Pakistan. And this sort of thing, if people even are paying attention to the protests that took place last summer at the Islamic Center in southern Manhattan, and the referendums I mentioned, there was at least 12 to 20 states that now have ballot referendums or had that ban Sharia. And I just think, for the most part, and again, I engage probably, government leaders, political leaders. I do some media in some of these places, so I get outside of the little bubble that I'm in. But it doesn't come up. B, if it does, it further reaffirms the notion that sort of some people in our politics in the U.S. are focused on the wrong sorts of things. So, but I would say, Marwan, top line is that it makes us look. I'm not a declinist at all in terms of U.S. power. I fundamentally believe that the U.S., despite its economic difficulties, we're still going to play a major leadership role throughout the rest of my adult lifetime. The nature of leadership and power, I think, has changed fundamentally, and people understand this. So these sorts of things, Matt, you mentioned Matt Duss. People should read that report. That was mostly like trying to uncover the large and significant amounts of money delivered by U.S. conservative foundations to some of these campaigns that I don't think foster a spirit of understanding and openness, and in fact do quite the contrary. But your question, I think it's largely seen as irrelevant. And there's this question of, long before President Obama was even thinking of running for president, there was this question about the U.S. role in the Middle East that was bubbling up around 2005, 2006, of how much leverage do we actually have? And I think, back in 2005, when we were mired in a civil war in Iraq, when things like not taking care of our own people after the Hurricane Katrina hit, I'll always remember I was in the Middle East and I saw a political cartoon in one of the newspapers, I think it was in Egypt, which had sort of an image of George Bush, the president, with very strong arms like this and flexing. And it said in Arabic, superpower. And then he was wearing a skirt that looked like a hurricane that said Katrina. And then right underneath that skirt was very weak legs. And it struck me at that moment that a lot of people in the region had seen, and again, we're a great country and we're the best. I'm biased. I think America has a lot to offer, but I think we did ourselves a lot of damage in terms of our power and credibility by policy mistakes like Iraq, by policy mistakes like here at home. And I think the global economic crisis damages a little bit our credibility. But so this Islamophobia thing in that context, Marwan, I think is seen as sort of like a head-scratching oddball, rather than offensive, they're out to get us. It's more of like, what's this all about, even if it comes up. And let me say one last thing. I think Father Ellis mentioned Syria and the prospect of John McCain's argument for a war in Syria. I think like the chance of that is zilch for a number of different reasons. And I think this goes back to any of you who want to go into sort of policy or political roles. I think the real sort of serious policymakers that are looking at all of the options here understand that there aren't many good military options when it comes to isolating this regime in Syria. And I don't have a clear answer to it. I think trying to isolate it politically and economically, which Turkey and other countries are kind of trying to do, is the fundamental sort of centerpiece of the struggle. But it makes it much more complicated, going back to the one things I tried to say, is one of our supposed allies, the Maliki government in Iraq, which we've invested clearly $800 billion to nearly $1 trillion in, won't even fundamentally agree with us on the need for pragmatic transition in Syria and is backing the Assad regime. That points to sort of all of the challenges of U.S. leverage and how much we can actually get actors in this part of the world to do that which we think is essential and necessary.
Yeah, well, and the only thing I would add to that is that, just to take a slightly different tack from the one Brian took, the effect of some of the Islamophobia here in the United States is that it diminishes the capacity of the very people in this country who are some of our best advocates within the region, people who are of Muslim faith who come from the region, and Arab Americans, both Christian and Muslim, who come from the region, who are here now, to be able to advocate on the United States' behalf back to their family and friends back in the region. Because, they get on the phone, imagine you're talking, you're here at college, you're talking to mom, hey, how are things in Villanova? How are things going? And you start telling her about a problem you're having. Well, imagine what that conversation is like when, you're an Arab American or a Muslim who lives in Oklahoma, right? That just passed the no Sharia law, and it's like, nobody's going to pass Sharia. How is that ever going to happen? But you've got these people who think that it's such a threat that they have to go and pass this law, and all they're doing is shooting us in the foot. So,
We're going to close this down. Do we have one more question? Yeah. Oh, we got two? Okay, go ahead.
I'm freaking.
What's going to happen with the Kurds? Is there ever going to be a Kurdistan, or is that pretty much done now that we're moving out?
I'll let Brian handle that. I know this much about Kurdistan.
The question was, I'm sorry,
What's going to happen with the Kurds, Brian?
What's going to happen to the Kurds? I suspect, the Kurds, I don't think they'll ever formally have an independent state, de jure, in terms of legal and sort of on the ground. I don't know if you've been there, if any of you have been there, but when you cross the border, especially compared to 2003, when there was not as many checkpoints, but there's effectively, in most sort of going into large cities like Erbil, there's effectively you don't need a visa to get into Kurdistan, but I think it'll stay part of Iraq, technically, but I think the real future of many parts, not only of Kurdistan and the Kurdish region of Iraq, the real future, and I think the real challenge for you if you go into this field, or any of you, us as analysts, is what are the sort of creative notions of sovereignty that can be introduced. And you look at some places in Europe that have done this already, and maybe it's unrealistic, but I just think the Kurds have had a strategy for a couple of decades now of carving out relative autonomy. They understand that given the opposition to complete independence that comes not only from Baghdad, but Turkey, Iran, its neighbors, it pragmatically does what it can do. And you go to sort of Sulaymaniyah, and I just got invited by the head of the Kurdistan regional government, Barzani, to go out there either in a couple of weeks or maybe probably more likely in the spring, and they built stuff on the ground. So I think the future will be one in which they're carving out a different future than the rest of Iraq will see, but technically it'll stay part of it. They'll have fights over things like oil revenue sharing and other things. And I think for the most part, it'll stay peaceful. And this is the last thing I'll say, and I'll go on here, but I think the thing everybody should worry about with the Iraq drawdown, one of the key things, and I've been a proponent of sort of getting out militarily for quite some time, but one of the key things we should watch very carefully is the status of Kirkuk and other disputed territories, which is the band of sort of cities and towns that are between Iraqi controlled KRG, Kurdistan region government controlled area, and Iraq proper. There have been several incidents in the last 3 years, including one in the town of Khanaqin in the summer of 2008, where Iraqi army drew weapons on Kurdish Peshmerga, both of whom we support, and were it not for lower level sort of U.S. military intervention and negotiation and diplomacy, there could have been a major clashes erupt. There have been joint patrols set up as a result of some of these incidents. And now that, I think some of those joint patrols will likely go away. So I think it'll start, answer your question, largely remain peaceful, but let's remain very worried about the status of these disputed territories between the Kurdish regional government, the autonomous region, and the Iraqi government proper, which the UN, no mediator has been able to resolve, in large part because, we were fixated on other issues, like trying to stabilize Baghdad, and never got down to sort of these thorny issues that may be unresolvable.
I think the regional autonomy in the Basque Land or Südtirol in Italy are good examples of what Kurdistan will be.
Yeah, I mean, I really like that approach that Brian took, because I think that's right. And the only thing I wanted to say was that point that I made early on when I was talking about how at Villanova, the grounding that I got in political philosophy was useful moving forward. At the time, I didn't really realize that. I didn't think so. But so when you're in those classes and you're thinking about those big questions that don't seem to have any immediate relevance maybe to the world today, think about this issue that you just asked and what Brian said, because they clearly do. Right? I mean, how we address a changing world depends on the values and the philosophies that we bring to it about how people should be structured. My own opinion that I've come to over the years is that the future of the world is about bigger relationships for the big issues and smaller relationships for the smaller issues. So, like what the EU is doing, right? With this idea that you're going to have people coming together in bigger relationships to deal with economics and defense and these other things, but people should be able to decide what language they want to have their educational system, or what kind of coursework they want their kids to learn, or who's going to pick up the trash and so forth and so on. So it's just something to think about.
Okay, before I let you go, 5 years from now, Tunisia, Egypt. I just want to hear real quick from both of you. And the other thing is, Brian and David, I have at least 2 students who are in the military here. Are they going to wind up in Afghanistan in 2 years?
Go ahead.
What's the future of them, our military, our Bratzies here?
Well, let me answer that one first. I mean, I don't know if I guess it doesn't matter as much which branch of the service you're in, but I'm not an advocate for this necessarily, but I think Afghanistan is a little bit more complicated, as complicated as Iraq was. And I suspect after 2014, we'll probably have some sort of sizable presence. The sort of work I've been trying to do, more of the less public but private behind the scenes, the advice that we give to people who are running this policy is to try to help figure out what their strategy actually is. I suspect that despite the drawdown and the plans to get down from 100,000 to 68,000 next year, there's going to be an ongoing sort of commitment to a lot of these places. And I would even be as bold to predict that you're not likely to get deployed to Iraq, but we're going to have some sort of military presence on the ground, despite the public statements of Maliki and Obama. I don't advocate necessarily for it, but I think we're in these places. A big part of it is to help them help themselves. And unfortunately, I think we've had an over-militarized approach to that. We've placed so much of the burden on the shoulders of our young men and women in the military, and more needs to be done by the State Department and AID, and they haven't really picked up the slack. So I think, I don't know if you're going to be deployed, I don't know what branch you're in, but I think we're going to have some presence there for quite some time, in large part because I think the bigger issue is what do we do about Pakistan? And I don't think keeping large numbers of boots on the ground is always a wise thing, but I think it would be foolish to predict that we'd be all out of Afghanistan by 2014. On Egypt and Tunisia, I mean, let me just focus on Egypt, Marwan. 5 years from now, I don't know. I think best case scenario, I think any honest Middle East analyst, given the uncertainties, and if you consider this as like, an equation with a number of different variables on it, there's so many moving pieces here. My best hope and dream for a place like Egypt, and I'm going to use 2 countries that start with the letter P. My best hope is that it looks a lot more like Poland, which actually has a pretty open political system, dealt with decades of being under the crushing grip of authoritarianism, and has an economy that grows and provides for its young generations. The worst case scenario is Pakistan. And I say this with full sort of admiration and love for many people in Pakistan. Tens of millions of people who want a more decent Pakistan, but they don't have it just yet. And they have a security state that I think controls large parts of not only their politics and the security situation, obviously, but also their economy. So my biggest worry is that 5 years from now, turning the corner from 2016 into 2017, we will see in Egypt, best case scenario, where it's opened up, its full potential of its younger generation is realized by its system, and it's reemerging as a leader in that part of the world. And I actually believe that that's quite possible. The biggest worry that I have, though, is that the powers that be that have run Egypt since essentially the 1950s will continue in some form or fashion to play a role behind the scenes. And that on balance could lead to a very ugly situation for the Egyptian people and for the people of the region. And I also think it'll be a challenge for U.S. policymakers. So it's those two different pathways. And I hope, again, it'll be more like Poland rather than Pakistan.
David?
So I'll leave the point about ROTC to Brian. Who are the two folks who are in the ROTC program? So, more than two.
Three.
Three? So first of all I'll say is thank you for your service, and God bless as you move forward. But with regard to Egypt and Tunisia, I would say that you can't put the genie back in the bottle, right? So Egyptians have realized, and Tunisians have realized their own power, and you have a certain subset of the population which really understands how to use that power. That said, the protests in Tahrir have gotten smaller and smaller and harder to reorganize. And Brian's absolutely right. The forces that are running the country today are the same forces that were behind Mubarak. And to a certain extent, what they're trying to figure out how to do is how do we, okay, we got rid of Mubarak, but how do we basically keep things the same while making people think that everything has changed because he's gone. We don't want to mess this up too much. And so I think there's going to be, Brian's talked a lot about this sort of, as they move forward, there's going to be this tumult, right, as they try to figure it out. And what makes me optimistic is what I've said already about the fact that they understand their own power to a certain extent. But I'm also optimistic because I've seen the energy and the entrepreneurial nature of so many people in the region. Jordan is, to jump out of Egypt for a second, Jordan is bustling right now with young technology startups in Amman. Lebanon has a lot of creative energy around advertising in the region. It's become the advertising hub for the region. Cairo, Egypt has always had a dynamic film industry, has the potential to have a dynamic tech industry. Tunisia has a tech industry. I think that if the governments of these countries do everything they can to open up the potential, to allow the people to take responsibility for their own lives, to create businesses, to create wealth, the region is well positioned because of its location, because of the amount of education that people have, because of relative stability in some of these countries, to be able to really be an engine, an economic engine, not only for themselves, but as a place that jobs, sadly, from our country, continue, get outsourced, but also from Europe. The jobs get outsourced from the region, particularly from Europe, because of its extreme proximity to Europe. So, I mean, I think I am optimistic, but nervous.
On behalf of our class, I'd like to thank both Brian and David. I found the discussions very informative, and look forward to having you guys here again soon. I'll see you on November 12th or 10th, whenever you're here, Brian. So
Great, yeah, and feel free to